Greetings and welcome back to 303 in Junior English. We now turn in your hymnals to page 796, 797. I hope that you're there. We are going to now turn to a series of works of short fiction. Now, for some time we've been in poetics. We now turn to some works of short stories. On page 796, you're going to be reminded of something that you were taught, several times in your academic career. But let's just review it. You probably will write it down in your notes as the plot hill. Do you remember this project where you have a certain kind of little hill and then we're going to write words around that hill explaining the different elements of short fiction? Now, a lot of this stuff comes from a guy named Freytag, who was a great German dramaticist. And he pointed out that fundamentally there seems to be three elements to a story: a beginning, a middle, and an end. Let's go ahead and read on 796 just to be reminded of this information. A short story is a brief work of fiction. Short stories have no fixed length, but most can be read in one sitting. A short story includes the key literary elements of fiction. We'll start with plot, the sequence of events. By the way, each one of these terms in bold, make sure you have in your notes because they'll end up on the examination. Plot is the sequence of events that make up the story, the map of the story, we might say. A story's plot focuses on a central conflict, we want to write that word down, or struggle, that the main character will face. Driven by this conflict, the plot follows a pattern called the dramatic arc or plot hill. Now let's pause for a moment and remind ourselves we have two kinds of conflict in story. One is an external conflict, the other is internal conflict. Under external conflict, let's remember that we will want to list character versus another character, character versus nature or the forces of nature, character versus some idea or society. In terms of internal conflict, let's remind ourselves that we're talking about character versus self, right? During the exposition, let's get that word down, that's the beginning of the story, the character, setting, and conflict are introduced. The conflict intensifies during the rising action, reaching its point of highest tension during the climax. That is to say, when the conflict comes to its fullest identification. The intensity of the conflict lessens during the falling action, what some would call the denouement, and ends during the resolution, the end of the story. Characters, our next bullet point. The personalities who participate in the story. A writer uses techniques of characterization to develop and reveal characters. Of course, setting is the time and place of a story. The setting may serve as the background or it may play a crucial role in the story. Theme, of course, what we qualify at level 2A, right? The central idea, message, or insight a story explores. The reader may have to piece together different clues to infer the theme. Let's write down this term, one that you've heard before as well. Point of view, the perspective from which a story is told. With first-person point of view, the narrator as part of the story refers to himself or herself as I. With third-person point of view, the narrator stands outside the story and refers to all the characters as he or she. Finally, this is a huge one for the stories we're about to read, voice. The best short stories do more than simply relate a tale from start to finish. They express an author's distinct voice or personality on the page. Voice is conveyed through all the elements of the writing, including the author's syntax, grammar, tone, characters, plots, and themes. Just as no two singers sound precisely the same, so do authors' literary voices differ. Finally, the suggestion here is to read close, a close read, and concentrate on voice in fiction. These literary elements that contribute to voice appear in the model text at the right, and we have Sarah Orangewett's White Heron text as a model. I'm not going to spend time with that, but I do recommend that you take a look at that to just see each one of those in action, and by extension to be able to see those in the text that we'll be working with. We now turn to the first of our short pieces of short fiction on page 798. 799. Let's go there now, and we will introduce you to one of America's most influential and important authors, Ernest Hemingway. Let's begin with dates. You can see them there, 1899 to 1961. Let's read a little bit about Hemingway, shall we? The text we'll be studying is his short story, In Another Country. Ernest Hemingway's fiction expressed the sentiments of many members of the post-World War I generation. He wrote about people struggling to maintain a sense of dignity while living in a sometimes hostile world. First heading, The Red Cross. Hemingway, the son of a physician, was born and raised in Oak Park, Illinois. In high school, he played football and wrote newspaper columns. Eager to serve in World War I, he tried to join the Army, but was repeatedly turned away due to an eye defect. He joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps instead, and in 1918 was sent to the Italian front. Just before his 19th birthday, he was severely wounded and spent several months recovering in a hospital in Milan, Italy. These experiences helped shape his view of the world and provided material for his writing, including the story In Another Country. The next heading, Expatriates. After the war, Hemingway had a hard time readjusting to life in the United States. To establish himself as a writer, he went to Paris as a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star. In Paris, he befriended Ezra Pound, who we met when we were studying T.S. Eliot, Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the author of Great Gatsby and Winter Dreams, who we've already studied, and other American writers and artists living overseas. The literary advice of these friends and his work as a journalist helped him develop a concise, concrete, highly charged writing style. In 1925, Hemingway published his first major work, In Our Time, a series of loosely connected short stories. A year later, he published The Sun Also Rises, a novel about a group of British and American expatriates trying to overcome the pain and disillusionment of life in the modern world. Final heading, A Famous Life. Hemingway eventually became as famous for his lifestyle as he was for his writing. Constantly pursuing adventure, he hunted big game in Africa, attended bullfights in Spain, held records for deep-sea fishing in the Caribbean, and participated in amateur boxing. The full body of Hemingway's work, including several titles, A Farewell to Arms from 1929, For Whom the Bell Tolls 1940, and The Old Man and the Sea 1952, earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. Let's turn now to page 798 and the literary analysis information that will be significant. Let's write this information down at level 2B really quickly. Ernest Hemingway's style, let's write that down, style, is among the most influential in American literature. It's characterized by economy, that means there's not a lot of language, and vigorous English, a phrase he encountered in the style guide of a newspaper for which he once wrote. That style has certain specific ingredients. 1, syntax. Hemingway's sentences are short, direct, and forceful. You will see this right away when we study In Another Country. His word choice. He uses plain language and few, if any, adjectives. I would write that down. One of the things you're going to find out is that Hemingway writes without a lot of adjectives to describe the nouns in his sentences. Finally, tone. Hemingway suggests emotion, but does not explain them or directly state what characters feel. The reader is left to interpret textual clues. These elements of Hemingway's style are evident in his description of an Italian army officer's reaction to distressing news. Quote, "He looked straight past me and out through the window. Then he began to cry." End quote. Hemingway's style marries perfectly with his themes, the messages or insights into life that reoccur throughout his work. Hemingway's themes address ideals of heroism and courage, relationships between young and old, and the loss of innocence in a disappointing and violent world. As you read In Another Country, look for trademarks of Hemingway's style in the development of 2 or more of his significant themes. Notice how these themes interact and add to the richness of his story. The reading strategy suggested on 798 with your sidebar there of a Venn diagram is to identify with characters, right? And finally, you have 3 vocabulary words that I recommend that you take a look at. All right, let's turn now to the story itself. In another country, we're on page 801. Let's look at the background information for just a moment. World War I, the first truly global war, began in Europe in 1914, sparked by nationalist pride and systems of alliances among nations. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, fought the Allies, England, France, Russia, with other nations joining one side or the other. The United States entered the war late on the side of the Allies. Italy, where this story takes place, was not strategically important, but it helped the Allies by drawing Central Power troops away from the other battle areas. The war lasted 4 brutal years. Throughout most of the conflict, a stalemate existed. Both sides were dug into trenches and took turns rushing one another. Each rush was greeted by a barrage of machine gun fire, with thousands falling dead. Other soldiers fell to new weapons, inventions such as airplanes, long-range artillery, and tragically poison gas. Many of the wounded were saved, however, by advances in medical treatment such as surgical disinfectants and rehabilitative techniques to strengthen injured limbs. Okay, let's turn now to this selection. It's a story about a soldier in World War I military hospital, right? Describing a time it does not create and then resolve a single conflict in the story. The narrator is an American serving as an officer in the Italian army during World War I, and he convalesces, that means he gets well, after a serious injury to his leg. He befriends other wounded soldiers but feels isolated from them. I would write that down. The feeling of isolation or alienation that we've been seeing in a number of the other texts we've studied, Proof Rock and Unknown Citizen, come to mind. The narrator is, quote, in another country, end quote, both physically and emotionally. Okay, we've got now a professional reader. Follow along. Let's listen to the story now, paying close attention to Hemingway's style, all right?
In Another Country by Ernest Hemingway. In the fall, the war was always there, but we did not go to it anymore. It was cold in the fall in Milan, and the dark came very early. Then the electric lights came on, and it was pleasant along the streets, looking in the windows. There was much game hanging outside the shops, and the snow powdered in the fur of the foxes, and the wind blew their tails. The deer hung stiff and heavy and empty, and small birds blew in the wind, and the wind turned their feathers. It was a cold fall, and the wind came down from the mountains. We were all at the hospital every afternoon, and there were different ways of walking across the town through the dusk to the hospital. 2 of the ways were alongside canals, but they were long. All as though you crossed a bridge across a canal to enter the hospital. There was a choice of 3 bridges. On one of them, a woman sold roasted chestnuts. It was warm standing in front of her charcoal fire, and the chestnuts were warm afterward in your pocket. The hospital was very old and very beautiful, and you entered through a gate and walked across a courtyard and out a gate on the other side. There were usually funerals starting from the courtyard. Beyond the old hospital were the new brick pavilions, and there we met every afternoon and were all very polite and interested in what was the matter, and sat in the machines that were to make so much difference. The doctor came up to the machine where I was sitting and said, "What did you like best to do before the war? Did you practice a sport?" I said, "Yes, football." "Good," he said. "You will be able to play football again better than ever." My knee did not bend, and the leg dropped straight from the knee to the ankle without a calf, and the machine was to bend the knee and make it move as in riding a tricycle. But it did not bend yet, and instead the machine lurched when it came to the bending part. The doctor said, "That will all pass. You are a fortunate young man. You will play football again like a champion." In the next machine was a major who had a little hand like a baby's. He winked at me when the doctor examined his hand, which was between 2 leather straps that bounced up and down and flapped the stiff fingers, and said, "And will I too play football, Captain Doctor?" He had been a very great fencer, and before the war, the greatest fencer in Italy. The doctor went to his office in the back room and brought a photograph which showed a hand that had been withered almost as small as the major's before it had taken a machine course, and after was a little larger. The major held the photograph with his good hand and looked at it very carefully. "A wound?" he asked. "An industrial accident," the doctor said. "Very interesting, very interesting," the major said, and handed it back to the doctor. "You have confidence?" "No," said the major. There were 3 boys who came each day who were about the same age I was. They were all 3 from Milan, and one of them was to be a lawyer, and one was to be a painter, and one had intended to be a soldier. And after we were finished with the machines, sometimes we walked back together to the Café Cova, which was next door to the Scala. We walked the short way through the communist quarter because we were 4 together. The people hated us because we were officers, and from a wine shop someone called out, "Abbasso gli ufficiali," as we passed. Another boy who walked with us sometimes, and made us 5, wore a black silk handkerchief across his face because he had no nose then, and his face was to be rebuilt. He had gone out to the front from the military academy and been wounded within an hour after he had gone into the front line for the first time. They rebuilt his face, but he came from a very old family, and they could never get the nose exactly right. He went to South America and worked in a bank, but this was a long time ago, and then we did not any of us know how it was going to be afterward. We only knew then that there was always the war, but that we were not going to it anymore. We all had the same medals, except the boy with the black silk bandage across his face, and he had not been at the front long enough to get any medals. The tall boy with a very pale face, who was to be a lawyer, had been a lieutenant of Arditi, and had 3 medals of the sort we each had only 1 of. He had lived a very long time with death, and was a little detached. We were all a little detached, and there was nothing that held us together except that we met every afternoon at the hospital. Although, as we walked to the Cova through the tough part of town, walking in the dark, with light and singing coming out of the wine shops, and sometimes having to walk into the street when the men and women would crowd together on the sidewalk so that we would have had to jostle them to get by, we felt held together by there being something that had happened that they, the people who disliked us, did not understand. We ourselves all understood the Cova, where it was rich and warm and not too brightly lighted, and noisy and smoky at certain hours, and there were always girls at the tables and the illustrated papers on a rack on the wall. The girls at the Cova were very patriotic, and I found that the most patriotic people in Italy were cafe girls, and I believe they are still patriotic. The boys at first were very polite about my medals, and asked me what I had done to get them. I showed them the papers, which were written in very beautiful language and full of fratellanza and abnegazione, but which really said, with the adjective removed, that I had been given the medals because I was an American. After that, their manner changed a little toward me, although I was their friend against outsiders. I was a friend, but I was never really one of them after they had read the citations, because it had been different with them, and they had done very different things to get their medals. I had been wounded, it was true, but we all knew that being wounded, after all, was really an accident. I was never ashamed of the ribbons, though, and sometimes, after cocktail hour, I would imagine myself having done all the things they had done to get their medals. But walking home at night through the empty streets with the cold wind and all the shops closed, trying to keep near the street lights, I knew that I would never have done such things, and I was very much afraid to die, and often lay in bed at night by myself, afraid to die, and wondering how I would be when I went back to the front again. The 3 with the medals were like hunting hawks, and I was not a hawk. Although I might seem a hawk to those who had never hunted, they, the 3, knew better, and so we drifted apart. But I stayed good friends with the boy who had been wounded his first day at the front, because he would never know now how he would have turned out. So he could never be accepted either. And I liked him because I thought perhaps he would not have turned out to be a hawk either. The major, who had been the great fencer, did not believe in bravery, and spent much time while we sat in the machines correcting my grammar. He had complimented me on how I spoke Italian, and we talked together very easily. One day I had said that Italian seemed such an easy language to me that I could not take a great interest in it. Everything was so easy to say. "Ah, yes," the major said. "Why then do you not take up the use of grammar?" So we took up the use of grammar, and soon Italian was such a difficult language that I was afraid to talk to him until I had the grammar straight in my mind. The major came very regularly to the hospital. I do not think he ever missed a day, although I am sure he did not believe in the machines. There was a time when none of us believed in the machines, and one day the major said it was all nonsense. The machines were new then, and it was we who were to prove them. It was an idiotic idea, he said, a theory like another. I had not learned my grammar, and he said I was a stupid, impossible disgrace, and he was a fool to have bothered with me. He was a small man, and he sat straight up in his chair with his right hand thrust into the machine and looked straight ahead at the wall, while the straps thumped up and down with his fingers in them. "What will you do when the war is over, if it is over?" he asked me. "Speak grammatically." "I will go to the States." "Are you married?" "No, but I hope to be." "The more of a fool you are," he said. He seemed very angry. "A man must not marry." "Why, Signor Maggiore?" "Don't call me Signor Maggiore." "Why must not a man marry?" "He cannot marry. He cannot marry," he said angrily.